Blackwell and
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, thank you once again for joining us for Philosophy in the Bookshop. We're delighted to have with us once more Sir Roger Scruton today. He'll be discussing his latest book on human nature. There'll be a signing that follows the talk and a time for questions. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Nigel Warburton and Sir Roger Scruton.
Thank you very much. I should say the format of this event is we're going to have a conversation of about half an hour and then open up for questions from the floor. So please don't interrupt while we're having a conversation. It'll be signalled, but there will be plenty of time to take questions. But as there are so many people, we may not be able to get all the questions in. Then at midday, there'll be an opportunity to buy Roger's book and get it signed personally by him, if you want to, and other books by him, and other authors.
You can sign my book if you like.
So probably many of you already know who Roger is, but just for a very quick recap, he's unusual in being a freelance philosopher, perhaps less by choice than me, I don't know. He was knighted for his services to philosophy. He's a very prolific writer, very controversial in political areas. An interesting combination for me of analytic philosopher who is very well informed about continental philosophy and often brings the best of it into his work. So I thought I'd just begin by asking him a little bit about that before we get into the questions about human nature. So Roger, could you just say what your experience of analytic philosophy has been?
Right, well, how's this working? I'm not sure it is. There you are. Okay. So I was brought up at school as a natural scientist, and I went to Cambridge with a science scholarship. Although I've become very interested in art and music and things like that meanwhile. But I changed to philosophy, and then, of course, philosophy at Cambridge was rigorously analytic. Let's say we studied articles in journals almost uniquely, and we didn't read the classics. It was I read Kant because I specialised in him in my third year, but until that I think I'd not read any history of philosophy at all, and had very little acquaintance with the continental schools. It was all Moore and Russell and Wittgenstein and Frege's logic and so on, which was a fantastic education. I've always adhered to the view that the really educational subjects are those which are not about anything, like mathematics or Latin, not about anything real, I mean. And here, our analytical philosophy was very much in that mould. It was a training for the brain, the application of which you couldn't possibly conceive. And then at a certain stage, of course, I began to think, well, what is the application of all this, given that life exists apparently, so they say it was rumoured, outside the walls of Cambridge. And I eventually ended up in France and got extremely interested in what was happening there. And my own literary bent already took me in the direction of fiction and poetry and so on. And gradually I realised that, wonderful though the training that I'd received was, the subject matter was still something that I had to grasp. And the subject matter is exactly the matter of this book, human nature. And what is it to be the kind of thing that we are in the world in which we find ourselves? And that was not something that, an answer to which you could find anywhere in the classics of analytical philosophy.
Well, you might expect somebody thinking about human nature to go to biology. I mean, you're saying you're a natural scientist, you've studied biology, you're a keen experiencer of the countryside and the natural world. We live in an age where there are all kinds of explanations given in terms of evolutionary periods, as if there's been a renaissance in Darwinian understanding of what we are, a combination of genetics, a bit of neuroscience and evolutionary biology, some of it very speculative, has given us a different picture of what we are. Could you say something about that? I mean, are you sympathetic to the idea that science will give us a good understanding of what it is to be human, perhaps a better understanding than philosophy could have?
Well, this is obviously one of the big questions of our day. It's not that people were not aware beforehand of the fact that we are animals and that we have a biology, but it's rather that this fact has been articulated in a way which is quite new by people like Dawkins and the evolutionary psychologists generally. That's to say, the facts of biology have been brought to bear on the human world, in particular on our moral experience, on our religious experience, on aesthetic values, the law and so on. All has been turned, as it were, passed through the evolutionary machine to come out the other end looking very different from what it looked like in the beginning. And of course people have both been, if you like, charmed by this and also repelled by it. Repelled because it delivers results that for many people are quite difficult to cope with. And we've had the recent, slightly quite amusing experience of the man at Google who said that there are not very many women at the top of Google because the female brain is different from the male brain. A truth which doesn't need explaining to a biologist, but nevertheless, of course, it has implications which impact on the whole orthodox morality of the day. And this is only one example of a widespread sense that somehow the biological picture of the human being is invading our previous moral certainties and leaving them in disarray. So one of the things that I try to do in this book is to use philosophy to repair some of the damage. To say, look, of course biology is a science. You can't dispute its results, not at least unless you dispute them from the point of view of a biologist. But it doesn't give us the whole truth about our nature. And one of the uses of philosophy is to show this and to repair the rents in the Lebenswelt.
Just to hold on to the evolutionary biological perspective a bit, surely the problem isn't evolutionary biology, it's just that it's not very sophisticated. There are a lot of just so stories. So you pull out one which I'm quite sympathetic to your analysis of this with Dennis Dutton, the philosopher of art, who took very seriously this research that suggested that the most popular pictures for all human beings have a bit of water, some climbable trees and a hill, because in the Paleolithic period human beings needed that stuff and felt very reassured by it. Therefore, art, landscapes which have these features in are particularly appealing to human beings who've been selected by a process of evolution to survive because they had a bit of water, a bit of shelter, they could climb a tree to get away from a wild animal, and they could run up to the hills and seek protection there. And that is just a speculative just so story about why a particular kind of picture is appealing. And it's hard to find the counter evidence that would undermine that theory. You could just as easily say that, well, people like pictures of rolling hillsides because they're reminiscent to the lines of the breast of a breastfeeding mother, and there's no easy way to discriminate between those evolutionary stories. But surely the problem isn't that kind of stuff which is easy to ridicule. It's that we don't have enough information. It's not that there won't be a biological evolutionary explanation. It's just we are in the early days of discovering the evidence that will support a clear picture of why we are as we are.
Well, yes and no. Of course, you can constantly go on sophisticating the biological explanation of our experience, finding more details that will fill in the gaps and so on. But the real problem is not the explanation of the experience, but the description of it. What is the experience that people are trying to explain? In the example you take, Dennis Dutton's explanation of our delight in this particular kind of landscape painting. what is the experience that he is trying to explain? Is it simply the fact that we say yes, that's nice? You find landscapes like that in every kind of motel, and your first response is, God, what kitsch. Get me out of here. The fact is, we don't respond in the way that he is saying we respond. We respond critically by putting these things in a wider context and saying, you can't do that kind of thing, since Cézanne. Just stop. Why can't you do it? You can't do it because we bring to bear on our experience so much else. Our understanding of human relations, our sense of what it's like to be in a particular place, what is called upon in us by a landscape, and this, to understand landscape painting in the way that it is actually understood by people, you should look into the artistic history of it. How was it that the background to a Raphael Madonna suddenly became the foreground? What was it about the human condition which pushed that holy thing into the background and replaced it with this other thing which became holy in the place of it? That's a huge subject matter which concerns the way the world appears to us and how we relate to it.
I'm sympathetic to that view, but surely that's human culture, not human nature. What Dutton's describing is the given, as it were,
yeah.
And what you're describing is the recent cultural background which gives meaning to those kinds of works of art, despite our tendency to be attracted to what you call kitsch.
But human culture is part of human nature too. It's not as though this is something apart from our biology either. We are by nature cultural animals. And that means that not just that we have these biological foundations to our thinking, but that we build on those foundations all kinds of mystical structures which are much more important to us than the thing on which they rest. It's understanding those great structures that is the role, in my view, of a certain kind of philosophy. It's our loss of understanding of it which has led to many of the confusions in our world.
Okay, so you mentioned the Lebenswelt, and that's very nicely explained in an appendix, I think, to your book, Sexual Desire. But for the benefit of those people who haven't read that book, could you just say a little bit about what that means and what part it plays in your philosophy?
Sure. The word Lebenswelt means life world, and the world as it presents itself to self-conscious beings like us. The word life is perhaps a bit misleading. It is to do with self-consciousness. We live in the world in a way that animals do not live in it, with a sense of the self and the other and the relation between them. And through that interaction with other people, we construct a shared picture of what we belong to and what belongs to us. That is the Lebenswelt, roughly speaking. And there are features of the Lebenswelt which correspond to ordinary physical realities, like the ordinary objects and animals and people intrude into it, but there are also features of it which have no clear connection with the physical world. My Lebenswelt contains atmospheres, it contains forebodings, moments of beauty and transcendence. It contains harmony and rhythm and all those things. And as we examine all the things that are most important to us, we realise that they are not actually straightforwardly biological phenomena or straightforwardly physical phenomena. They concern the whole tapestry of our relations to each other and the world. And that, this concept of the Lebenswelt was introduced by Husserl. Husserl was a continental philosopher who really invented the so-called science of phenomenology. That's to say, the attempt to understand the way the world is and the way that I am through the introspective knowledge of my own mental states and the structure contained within them. And he spent a lot of his earlier years, scribbling away on how to identify all the things that were going on in his first-person awareness without any obvious success. Although there's a whole library of his papers in Belgium, which suggests that he never gave it up quite. But towards the end of his life, he realized that the crucial word in understanding the human condition is not the word I, but the word we. It's what that which unites us, which gives us a shared frame of reference, which we really need to understand. And it's only in our communal being that we really come to recognize that the world is something consistent and independent of ourselves. And so that was his way into this idea of the Lebenswelt. And I say that I sympathize with that when I think of one of the tasks of philosophy is to understand the Lebenswelt, understand that shared conception of how things are, which enables us not only to relate to the world, but to relate to each other in a coherent way.
So, Husserl was very much concerned with description. Philosophy is typically, as I understand it, concerned with argument. So, following an argument through logical steps to a conclusion. How are those compatible? Because he bracketed off questions about what actually existed and just focused on his inner experience, as we might call it.
Well, this goes back to where you began. Analytical philosophy is all about arguments, about validity, and what follows from what you can prove from what. But actually, I think that's a very narrow sphere of intellectual endeavour, which doesn't have very many results. And it's interesting that logic is the most controversial aspect of philosophy for that reason. But there is the other aspect of philosophy, which is not arguing but describing, trying to capture something. If you ask us, for instance, I've thought an awful lot about music and what it means. It's very hard to argue about music without somehow misrepresenting it. People can argue forever about whether the first chord of Tristan and Isolde is a half-diminished seventh. Well, there's hundreds of articles on this, but that doesn't say anything about why it is that this chord seems to be so unsaturated, to be demanding a resolution that never comes, and so on. The effort of describing what is going on in the prelude to Tristan and Isolde is also a philosophical effort, but it doesn't involve argument in quite the same way. And a lot of things that, in my view, have gone wrong with academic philosophy, especially here in Oxford, which is at the lowest level of intellectual accomplishment. A lot of what goes on comes because people want to import an idea of argument into things which they haven't properly described. If you think of all the arguments about that came into ethics with Derek Parfit's work and Peter Singer and so on, making all ethical questions into questions of calculation. How many people could be saved by this lifeboat if it goes in this direction as opposed to going in this direction? Should we save the old ones or the young ones, etc.? These great utilitarian calculations which replace the real problem, which is understanding why it is that we have obligations in the first place. What is an obligation? That's a problem of description, a problem about the Lebenswelt, which isn't going to yield to these analytical arguments.
Well, you mentioned that for Husserl the discovery was that we was more important than I, so a sense of community and the things we have in common, but notoriously we has limits. Where do you set the limits? Are you talking about humanity, and why stop there, if so? Or are you talking about particular subgroups of humanity? Are you talking about nations? Are you talking about political affiliations? Are you talking about people who happen to know Wagner's work? Where do you stop?
Well, there isn't any place where one, as it were, comes to a boundary in thinking. I think all of our efforts at understanding the world begin in a similar place. They begin in the eyes of our relation. You know, how is it that I situate myself in relation to you? And what is it that tells me about my own situation in the world? Obviously, I'm accountable to you, for instance. I can't just ignore the fact that you've asked this question with a distressed look on your face. But I have to respond. And these very basic things, which come to us, of course, through our initial connection with the mother and all the rest, they develop over time and gradually expand, gradually, as it were, that sense of myself and my accountability towards the world grows and matures, and it reaches out to the wider family, then to the community, and so on. And this is a process which is beautifully described by Hegel in the Philosophy of Right, where he argues that we acquire our sense of obligation from this immersion in the family, where our obligations are not chosen. They're, as it were, we stumble across them, and we can't reject them. But through maturing in connection with those obligations, through coming to a sense that they really are my own, I acquire a kind of freedom, a freedom to create new obligations. And out of that comes civil society. But civil society is unstable without the law that holds it in place. So out of that comes the state, and so on. And I think we can all construct this kind of story as to how it is that beings like us gradually accumulate an expanding conception of their obligations towards the world and of the meaning of the world that comes from that. It doesn't follow, of course, that you can go on expanding forever and feel responsible for the universe. In general, people who make a big thing about being responsible for the universe are self-centered egoists for whom this is their great excuse. The question is knowing where to stop between self and everything.
So there's a question about where to stop with self and everything, but also with self and other people, particularly. So we're talking about the animal world, we're talking about human beings particularly. And a lot of that has to do with who we consider to be persons, which is the moral category rather than the biological one.
Yeah, this is a very good question, of course, because here it really does illustrate what philosophy can do. You can ask the question about that concept of the person. Just what is it? And what beings fall under this category and what don't? And what comes with the category of the person? The person, as we normally understand it, is a concept, or a term that came to us from the Roman law originally. It is a bearer of rights and duties. And that's what a person is, as opposed to a mere animal. And then, of course, you do have the question of where animals fit into all this. Animals which are not persons, or perhaps they're borderline cases, and all that effort of description is something which I obviously put quite a lot of thought into developing in my time. And I think, we at this particular time, because of the impact of biology on people's thinking, there is a lot of confusion as to what the boundary between persons and other kinds of animals is. And it's another area where philosophy can do some work.
So I think this may not be fair as a generalisation, but biology tends to put us more in touch with other kinds of animals, so that we see ourselves as just part of the animal world, which is how I see myself. And religion, amongst other things, tends to want to create a split between human beings and other kinds of animals. And so there's something radically different about a human being that gives us different kinds of responsibilities, different hopes for the future, and so on, and different ways of understanding each other. How important is your religious understanding of the world to your stance in this book on what human nature is?
Well, I see the religious form of understanding as an attempt to transfer onto the world this idea of our relation that is necessary for the proper maintenance of our life in any form. All religions people the world with gods. Some with only one god, the one that's with which we're familiar, but some with multiple gods. But the crucial thing about any god is that it has a first-person point of view. This was revealed to Moses in the famous passage in Exodus where he's, confronts the burning bush, which is God revealing himself to Moses, and he asks, "Who are you?" And all that God says is, "I am that I am." In other words, you don't know anything about me, you never will, except that I have a first-person point of view, just like yours. In other words, that there's a kind of declaration of personhood at the fount of the Jewish religion, which I think has been generalized by subsequent religions to give us a conception that there are persons, transcendental persons, which nevertheless don't have an animal being. Now, I don't necessarily go along with all that, but I do accept that we can look upon the world in such a way as to recognize that it is the free expression of a creative act and not just a fact.
The creative act of the god or the creative act of human beings?
We don't know. We can't know. But we constantly encounter in our everyday lives this distinction between things that are done and things that happen. And even in an object, to take Paley's example, the watch lying in the road, that's something done, not something that just happened. But the question is, can we really understand the world simply as the totality of things that happen, without also recognizing that in some way there's something done, and that we have to confront it with, as we confront each other, with this demand for reasons, accounts, who is to praise, is there to praise, and who is there to blame for all this?
Well, isn't there a difference between what we project onto the world and are helpless to prevent, and the way the world might actually be independently? So we can say that human beings tend to see animate causes of things. That's a dominant propensity in human beings, that we hear a noise and we think there's something out there, and there may be strong evolutionary reasons why we think there's somebody out there rather than just a twig falling from a tree, because the tendency to have false positives in that area will probably save our lives at some point. So we are constantly seeing.
You're constantly going back to this, the evolutionary psychologist's explanation. But to explain a thought is not necessarily to understand it. Let's go back to the example of music. If I listen to a melody in music, what I'm hearing is a sequence of sounds. Just say one pitch followed by another, just going up the major scale, like the second subject of Beethoven's violin concerto first movement, which everybody knows. Or if they don't, they should be ashamed of themselves. You can describe this in physical terms, and you can describe the effect of those vibrations on the follicles in the ear and the transfer of the information by digital processing to the hearing centres of the brain. All that would be a perfect explanation of what's going on when someone hears this music. But it doesn't actually describe the music, because the music, when you hear what goes on in that theme, you're not hearing a sequence of pitch sounds. You're hearing something that begins on F sharp and goes up to D, and it moves through the intervening notes of the scale, and it takes you with it. There's a swirling of emotion and a demand for a conclusion which hasn't yet come, and so on. All those aspects which are part of understanding the music as a feature in the Lebenswelt are left out of consideration by the scientific explanation, and have to be. And I want to say that this is true in general of our conception of the world, that the things that really matter are left out of consideration by the scientific explanation, not because they are extra facts, so to speak, but because they are the way that facts organize themselves in our own emotions. Religious stories work like that.
This would be a good moment to take questions from the floor. Just wondering, can I just ask you to ask brief questions, please, rather than make long statements? Because there are so many people here, there will be a lot of questions, I think. So, yeah.
Thank you. I think I disagree with you, really. I would say it is possible to explain human experience and motivation and what we term ethical obligations, maybe even sentiments, in a scientific explanation. I'm more on Dawkins' side, I think, on this. I don't think religion is as good a bet as maybe you're suggesting.
So for those of you who can't hear, the question is about the difference of opinion, as it were, is that this guy's saying that he thinks that you can give an adequate scientific explanation of ethical and other experiences of the human world.
Well, I'm not denying that you can give a scientific explanation, but I want to say that there is something that is left out of it. Here's an example. We all know that human beings have a natural aversion to incest. You can give a very good explanation as to why this is so. Namely that the human beings who didn't have that aversion have all died out. And you can develop that theory in the sort of Dawkins way, and it's very plausible. But that doesn't tell us what it is that we find repulsive in incest. The object of incest, it's my brother, it's my sister. I can't. It's untouchable. These ideas, which invade our conception of the other, are not part of the explanation. They don't have to be at all. Incest could be repulsive in the way that feces are repulsive, or something like that. It would explain the thing just as well. But the actual way of conceptualizing the world that we have, that makes incest repulsive to us, is left out of the consideration.
Okay, just to follow that point on a bit, you talked about an evolutionary way of thinking about mechanism. But there's also a kind of information processing and artificial intelligence, cognitive science, and thinking of things at a kind of higher level. And does that kind of, creating models, would that satisfy your desire for a kind of scientific explanation of these kinds of, you had a simulation of a model or a robot that showed the kind of functional states of the kind of art, you had a program that could appreciate music in the way that a human could.
So there's a question about if you could simulate, using a computer perhaps, the experience of listening to music, would that be a good way of showing understanding, an alternative from the evolutionary kind of explanation that's widely different?
I would go back to distinguishing the explanation of an experience from its meaning. Of course, going back to my example of the Beethoven violin concerto, you could easily construct, or not easily, you could imagine constructing a machine which modelled what was going on when people listened to those organised pitches in sequence. And you could imagine a sound engineer who was really good. He had absolute pitch to identify all the vibrations and reproduce it with a machine. Many sound engineers are like this. But when asked as to what was going on, they say, well, that's what I do, but I don't know what music is. Just as you can imagine somebody reproducing a picture by putting a graph over it, translating the colours from one point to point on another, and so on, producing a perfect reproduction, even though he'd never seen the face in it. There was that extra thing, if you like, the appearance, which is what really matters. And I want to say, and I do say this in some of my writings, that there is a law of human nature, which is the priority of appearance. Appearances are what count. A I think it was Oscar Wilde who said it's only a very shallow person who doesn't judge by appearances. And there's a deep truth in that.
Can you speak to what the concept of race means for you as far as your theory of human nature?
So the question is, can Roger give an account of race in relation to human nature?
Well, there might be in the biology of human beings room for a concept of racial difference, but of course it doesn't follow the impacts on the idea of the person. My view of human nature is that fundamentally we see each other as persons, and a person is a free being who identifies himself in the first person case and relates to others through ideas of accountability and obligation and so on. And race doesn't as such have any part to play in that, I would say. Although of course, going back to what we talked about at the beginning, there are biological differences between the sexes, which we are all aware of, which do impact on all kinds of things like people's achievements and so on. In that, and throughout human life, acts of biology will have an impact, but we don't conceptualize them in terms of the biology, and I think we shouldn't.
Yeah, this question here and there.
Created by our experience or our understanding of our experience. So when I admit this fact, I may hesitate when I make some decisions. So how would I deal with this problem? That's just a personal question.
So the question is about individual experience. So we recreate the world, or create the world, I guess, in our interaction with, in daily life. Is there any, I may misinterpret you here, but were you asking then, is there any advice about how we negotiate the world, given that we are kind of creating it on the hoof?
Well, I think this is what growing up consists in. That we're learning that our own attempts to understand that the templates that we construct for our own use are inadequate, and we gradually replace them, and we replace them under the impact of other people's encounter with us. Other people correct us, and the hope is that we emerge at some stage with a shared conception of the world, one that enables us to negotiate our solutions to our conflicts rather than to impose upon others what we absolutely want. And I think this for me is the sphere of politics as well. In politics, as opposed to tyranny, politics is a realm of negotiated solutions, and that's at least what we think in our democratic tradition. But it only emerged over time. The original human society was not a society formed out of negotiated solutions, but out of imposed commands.
How do we balance our own interests against those of future generations?
Okay, so how do we balance our own interests against those of future generations?
Well, first of all, we have to be motivated to do so. And this is one of the big questions. Where is the motive that brings future generations into the equation? I think this is a really interesting question. This is Hans Jonas, a German philosopher, wrote about this. The principle of responsibility of Verantwortung is the crucial thing, the thing that makes the difference for the human condition from the condition of an animal. That we look around for those to whom we are accountable for what we're doing, and they're not all of them alive now. Some of them are dead, and some of them are unborn. And I think Edmund Burke famously put his finger on this question when he said that in response to the French Revolution, that society is not just a contract among the living, it's a partnership between the living, the unborn and the dead. And only by respecting our obligations to the dead do we also respect our obligations to the unborn. So in other words, we must look at the world in a transgenerational way, and that's what the French Revolution was sweeping away, according to him. And I agree with that view, that we have to look on the world in this transgenerational way. But as with all obligations, the sphere of obligation sort of diminishes as it gets further away from you. My obligation to those who are coming in my children's lifetime, it does press on me urgently, but what about those 200 years' time, or those who are living, if there are any left, at the time when the sun goes into its great expansive mode? Should I worry about them being all burned up?
We're talking about the planet on the newspaper.
Yeah, it is. There we are. So, anyway, that's not a full answer. This is as far as philosophy can get with an answer.
So we've got 3 or 4 questions lined up here. So, sorry, the guy in front, and then you sort of, I was pointing in the same direction.
Do you accept that to some extent political conservatives have different natures from political liberals, and therefore that to some extent differences of political opinion are irreconcilable?
Gosh.
Did everyone hear that?
Yes.
Sorry, the question was, do you accept that people of different political persuasions, conservatives and liberals, for instance, have fundamental different takes on the world, and so there's not much hope of compromise? Is that fair?
Well, there is actually some neurological research about this that people like Susan Greenfield have gone into, and Jonathan Haidt, yes, that suggests that the Conservatives have big amygdalas, or whatever they are, and liberals have enhanced frontal lobes. I think it's all pretty meretricious, the research, but it could be that there are different dispositions towards the world. W.S. Gilbert famously said in one of the Gilbert and Sullivan operas, every child that is born alive is either a little liberal or a little conservative. I think there is some evidence that people do separate in this way. Not quite. It's partly cultural, but it might be partly biologically based. But on the other hand, I always entertain the hope that liberals will change their minds.
So at the biological level, there is clearly a well-established method or set of methods for reaching the truth or established facts. So at the level of the lived world, is there, I'm sure there isn't any mechanism rigorous, and if so, can we expect a less degree accuracy?
So the question is, in biology there are pretty well-established methods for establishing the truth, or something approximating the truth. With the lived world, are there any similar methods that are approved, and if not, should we expect less certain conclusions from our investigations?
I think this is one of the most important questions that really troubles me. It is obviously the case that science delivers results by an established scientific method. We don't, it's controversial exactly what scientific method is, but almost everybody who engages in scientific inquiry shares it with others who do so, and that's why there are such things as established results. In the case of understanding the world of cultural artifacts and the world of human relations, established results are rather harder to obtain. But it was always been the hope in the humanities, in humane forms of study, that there is such a thing as criticism, which does, as it were, not home in on the truth, but leads towards consensus. You know, and I think I'm of the view that this is possible, and that the consensus is valuable in itself. You know, we don't have any problems really in recognising the greatness of Beethoven or Shakespeare, and we can explain why, and there is a consensus as to why, and studying things in that way and expanding that consensus is to me a genuine form of education. It doesn't have a methodology in the way that science has, but it's nevertheless a shared intellectual endeavour.
Could you speak to the how identity politics relates to human nature?
Okay, so the question is, can Roger say something about identity politics, particularly in relation to how it plays out on university campuses?
Yes. It is the case that human beings do search for an identity in the sense of something that they belong to, which defines what they are, and, as it were, creates, if you like, a community around them, a community of like-minded or like-disposed people. In that sense, you know, I have quite a few, we all have a few identities, but you know, I identify myself as an Englishman, and I identify strongly with the fortunes of my country, and recognise that what I am depends upon what happens to it. You know, and that's an old-fashioned kind of identity. You know, and there are religious and other identities which are partly harmonised and partly in competition with it. But the new kind of identity politics looks to very different things, like biology, for instance, like sexual orientation, or one's way of defining oneself sexually. I was brought up in a world where people didn't define themselves sexually at all. Indeed, you know, the shocking encounter with the fact of sex, aged 16, came long after all my real identity as an ordinary English suburban boy. So, but now identities are pushed into the fore, partly because they are fragmenting, and partly because people cling to them as a way of not belonging to the surrounding culture. You know, the way of refusing the surrounding culture and saying, "I'm going to do it for myself. I will be a woman." You know, even though biologically I've had this problem of not being one. You know, and that has certainly invaded campuses, partly because young people, people of your generation, are much less certain about those other old identities like national identity, religious identity and so on, which seem so straightforward and seem to create a natural community around people. So they look for things which they can emphasise in order to distinguish themselves, rather than to be, as it were, absorbed into the whole.
I'm not a philosopher, but I see a small lack in your argument about Beethoven, the way that the brain and how you...
Sorry, there's quite a lot of background noise, it's quite hard for us to hear. Could you maybe stand up and then we'll hear you? So I got the first bit, you say you're not a philosopher, but you spotted a flaw in Roger's argument. That sounds
Talking about the scientific way of speaking about Beethoven and how you can explain what happens in the brain and what actually happens with sound and whatever, particles, whatever. What about psychology? Do you not think of psychology as a science? Because that's a science that talks about how the human being experiences things. There's an entire wall of books behind you all about that. And is that, do you not see that as a science in the same way as you see hard science like physics and biology? You talk a lot about neuroscience and stuff, but what about psychology?
Yeah, so for those of you who couldn't hear that, the question is, in understanding Beethoven, surely psychology can do the trick, basically. Is that, and psychology is a science, so what's the problem?
Are you studying psychology?
No, I'm a physicist.
Oh, right, there you are. Okay. When I studied philosophy at Cambridge, it was called moral sciences, and one big section of it was psychology. And all of us protested throughout our 3 years subjected to this, that this is only pretend science. That the real science has not been delivered. The real science surely is the science of the nervous system, and not these halfway houses that we were constantly being given by the psychology textbooks. Now, I don't necessarily agree entirely with that. Those are my adolescent feelings. But I have to say that psychology is short on established results in comparison with, say, brain science, and it isn't clear about its method. Whether the method is what I would say call phenomenology, studying the Lebenswelt, how the world appears to us, or whether it is looking into the deeper causes, the deeper way in which the brain functions, and so on. And there are lots of examples in the history of thought of halfway houses in science, which then get eliminated. Phrenology, the study of the shape of the skull and all of the different skull shapes which went with different forms of behaviour, that was eventually superseded when people realised that it hadn't got the proper explanatory concepts available. And I suspect that that's going to happen to psychology.
Are you really saying that something like this in bio-prison experiments don't enlighten us about human nature?
No, they enlighten us about human nature, but they give us more facts. But the actual theory here will require some theory of the brain processes, which has not yet been delivered. That seems reasonable to me. But this is a huge question that the lady has raised, the nature of psychology, and I may be wrong. I'm just taking a stand on my own experience of psychology as something which is a halfway house between empirical facts and philosophical theories.
Okay, so question back.
Shall I stand up? Well?
It's probably easier if you're supposed to hear you.
Okay, cool. If there are things about the human condition that can't be explained with biology, so for example, beauty and aesthetics and ethics and these things, then what is it that differentiates the human condition from the non-human, from the animal, if we can't explain it by biology?
So if there are these things like beauty, aesthetics, that can't be explained by biology, what is it that distinguishes human beings from other animals?
I think we're being misled here by the word explanation. There are things that can be explained, but which don't, by being explained, enable us to understand them. I gave the example of music, or painting likewise. You can explain all sorts of things without thereby giving to people the ability to understand what they mean. And I think that's what I would say is distinctive of the human condition. We live in a world of meanings, and the root of these meanings is the interpersonal relation, the I-to-thou relation, which is something that the other animals do not have. And we identify, when you identify yourself in the first person as I, and you look at me and speak like that from across the room, I recognise that I'm encountering another like me, and I want to respond to it, and I'm reaching to you with my words. I'm trying to focus on your eyes and what they're saying to me. But the thing that underlies your words and your look, namely your sense of yourself as meaning something, is not accessible to me. I'm constantly reaching beyond those words and those looks in order to seize the thing from which this all emerges. that thing is the thing that you refer to as I. I couldn't seize that thing. I couldn't be at the point of as it were, grasping that I without being you. So there's an impossibility at the heart of my communication with you, which is something that we live with all the time, but it creates a completely different world for us, a recognition that we're being addressed constantly from a point of view outside anything that we can, as it were, encounter directly. And that sense invades our whole conception of what we are for each other and how we live in this world. The infinite preciousness of the other person comes partly from this. You know, none of us we all of us feel that we have not got the right to extinguish that thing, the thing that glows in you, the I that you identify. And we're under your untouchability, the fact that I can't just treat you as a means to my end, etc. All that resides in this extraordinary fact, and that fact invades the rest of our experience in such a way as to transform the way the world is for us. Does that make sense to you? I mean, I say something about this in this book on human nature, which is going very cheap.
Just two more questions. So one here and one here. Okay. Have you already asked a question? No. Okay. Sorry. So this one first. Yeah.
So I do read quite a lot of articles and papers on psychology, and one thing that I noticed, I think that everybody notices, human beings, we're so diverse and we're so different, and so there is no perfect human brain that we can, the perfect human that we can examine. We can't look at a baby, which I guess is a blank canvas of humans can get, and they can't speak yet, they can't tell us too much. And I think psychology still has a place. I'm trying to articulate what it is. So, do you think there are ways of fixing up these holes in the scientific processes of psychology, like linking it to neuroscience, for example?
Okay, so the question is, look, psychology's got problems. Is there a way to fix them so that it will be adequate to explain meaning, not just facts of what people happen to do?
Yes, well, this is again, it goes back to obviously the young lady's question at the back. I don't want to say that psychology can't at some stage be fixed, so as to provide a full account of all the things that we've been talking about today. But the first thing it has to do is to recognise what those facts, what those things are that we've been talking about. You know, we need the right description of the content of our experience. It's very easy to explain things if you reduce them to something that they're not. You know, you can explain, for instance, the human altruism very easily in terms of game theory. You know, the strategy of genetic strategies which give an evolutionary advantage to species which make sacrifices for each other. You know, that explanation has been developed, and everybody in biology accepts it. You know, that altruism in that sense can be explained in terms of the adaptability of the genetic material. But you know, you don't explain human altruism with that theory unless you reduce human altruism to the kind of altruism that we observe in animals. You know, like the mother bear that protects her cubs by aggression, by exposing herself to risk and so on. You know, human beings are altruistic in a completely different way. They sacrifice themselves consciously for others. They make a choice to lay down their life for their friends and so on. And the actual motivation is an extremely complex thing. So, of course, I'm not saying that couldn't be explained, but you're going to have to give a much more complex explanation once you've got once you give the correct description of what it is that you're trying to explain. And my complaint against not only analytical philosophy but also against various pseudosciences that go with it is that the description of the phenomena has not been engaged in. You know, that's what we really need to do to understand how the world appears to us. So going back to Oscar Wilde's remark, understanding the appearances, which is the thing that the modern society is so bad at doing.
So we've got time for one brief last question, and then Roger will be available to sign books in the armchair here.
Probably at the beginning, it's probably at the end. Just relying with Nigel. Because that one would say from this science is things like reality. What he does say, for example, the lecture is not saying he's eliminating meaning.
So the question is it a category mistake to think that a scientist can talk about the meaning of the world? I think that's right.
Well, the question is, can the meaning of the world be the subject matter of scientific inquiry? And I would say no, it can't be. It can't be because the meaning is not given by the explanation. The meaning is that which we find in something when we react to it in this interpersonal way. And that the whole network of interpersonal reactions is what has to be left out by biology.
Okay, just before you thank Roger for a very stimulating conversation and responses to your questions, I should say that if you do want to buy this book and have it signed, it's okay to get it signed before you pay for it. So you can pick up the book here, get it signed by Roger, and then go to the tills upstairs.
Signing up there.
Oh, okay. So change the plan. So you have to follow Roger to the next level, as it were. But before you do that, just like to say thank you very much and very stimulating.
Okay, thank you once more for coming. If you just give us 2 minutes so Roger can get seated at the signing table, which will just be by the till. I just want to quickly tell you about the next three. We've got